Entropy, under a variety of names, has long been used as a measure of diversity in ecology, as well as in genetics, economics and other fields. There is a spectrum of viewpoints on diversity. Greater or lesser importance to rare species. There is a single distribution that maximizes diversity from all viewpoints simultaneously, and any list of species has an unambiguous maximum diversity value. The spectrum of viewpoints on diversity is as follows. Ecologists began to propose quantitative definitions of biological diversity in the mid-20th century, setting in motion more than 50 years of heated debate, dozens of further proposed diversity measures, hundreds of scholarly papers, at least one book devoted to the subject, and consequently, for some, despair. Already expressed by 1971 in a famously titled paper of Hurlbert. Meanwhile, parallel discussions were taking place in disciplines such as genetics. Economists were using the same formulas to measure wealth inequality and industrial concentration, and information theorists were developing the mathematical theory of such quantities under the name of entropy rather than diversity. Obtaining accurate data about an ecosystem is beset with practical and statistical problems, but that is not the reason for the prolonged debate. Even assuming that complete information is available, there are genuine differences of opinion about what the word diversity should mean. We focus here on one particular axis of disagreement, illustrated by the examples in Figure 1, which is as follows. In example A, there are 4 species, with the first dominant and the others relatively rare. In example B, the 4th species is absent but the community is otherwise evenly balanced. One extreme viewpoint on diversity is that preservation of species is all that matters. Biodiversity simply means the number of species present, as is common in the ecological literature as well as the media. Since no attention is paid to the abundances of the species present, rare species count for exactly as much as common species. From this viewpoint, community example A of Figure 1 is more diverse than community example B, simply because it contains more species. The opposite extreme is to ignore rare species altogether and consider only those that are most common. This might be motivated by a focus on overall ecosystem function. From this viewpoint, community example B is more diverse than community example A, because it is better balanced. Example A is dominated by a single common species, whereas example B has 3 common species in equal proportions. Between these two extremes, there is a spectrum of intermediate viewpoints, attaching more or less weight to rare species. Different scientists have found it appropriate to adopt different positions on this spectrum for different purposes, as the literature amply attests. Rather than attempting to impose one particular viewpoint, we will consider all equally. There is one important dimension missing from the discussion so far. We will consider not only the varying abundances of the species, but also the varying similarities between them. This is addressed in the next section. Critically, the word diversity refers only to the relative, not absolute, abundances. If half of a forest burns down, then it may be an ecological disaster. But assuming that the system is well mixed, the diversity does not change. In the language of physics, diversity is an intensive quantity, like density or temperature, rather than an extensive quantity, like mass or heat, meaning that it is independent of the system's size. Ecologically, it may sound shocking, Is it reasonable that diversity can be increased by eliminating some species? We argue that it is. Consider, for instance, a forest consisting of 1 species of oak and 10 species of pine, with each species equally abundant. Suppose that an 11th species of pine is added, again with equal abundance, figure 4. This makes the forest even more heavily dominated by pine, so it is intuitively reasonable that the diversity should decrease. But now running time backwards, the conclusion is that if we start with a forest containing the oak and all 11 pine species, eliminating the 11th should increase diversity. To clarify further, recall that diversity is defined in terms of the relative abundances only. Thus, eliminating a species causes not only a decrease, but also potentially an increase in the other relative abundances. If the species is particularly ordinary within the community, like the 11th species of pine, then eliminating it makes way for less ordinary species, resulting in a more diverse community. The instinct that maximizing diversity should not eliminate any species is based on the assumption that the distinction between species is of high value. If one wishes to make that assumption, one must build it into the model. After all, if 2 species were very nearly identical, or in the extreme, actually identical, then losing one would be of little importance. For decades, ecologists have used entropy-like quantities as measures of biological diversity. However, there is a growing appreciation that this crude model of a biological community is too far from reality, in that it takes no notice of the varying similarities between species. For instance, we would intuitively judge a meadow to be more diverse if it consisted of 10 dramatically different plant species than if it consisted of 10 species of grass. For the sake of concreteness, this discussion is applied in terms of an ecological scenario, a community of organisms classified into species. However, nothing that we do is intrinsically ecological, or indeed connected to any specific branch of science. Our results apply equally to any collection of objects classified into types.